Good afternoon. Where have you all been? It's great to see you again. Today we begin a series entitled simply Anonymous, God's Unnamed Disciples and the Difference They Made. We're going to consider just a small handful of personalities in Scripture whose names we don't know. We know a little more, a little less about their stories, but who continue to make a difference to us today. They are largely anonymous. Now, being anonymous is not always a bad thing. Story is told, you may remember it. Story is told of a woman, a bit older woman, arrived at a church, not unlike this one, and came into the service. It was largely full, so a deacon at the back said, "I'll help you find a place. Where would you like to sit?" She said, "I'd like to sit on the front row." "Oh, I don't think that's a good idea." "Why?" "I'd like to sit on the front row." "That's not really a good idea." "I want to sit on the front row." "Why is that not a good idea?" He said, "Well, it's our pastor. His sermons, you'll fall asleep. It's very awkward, embarrassing to be on the front row, and you've fallen asleep. So that's not a good place to sit." She looks at him rather shocked, says, "Do you know who I am?" He says, "No, who are you?" He said, "I'm the pastor's mother." He looked at her now shocked and said, "Do you know who I am?" She said, "No," and he said, "Good." And made his exit. Being anonymous is not always a bad thing. I love the story of the classroom in the public university, large class. So many students, the professor would never learn the names, really any of the names. They were just all names on a sheet and numbers on a list. End of the quarter, he said, "Okay, going to be a big test. It's going to be an essay test. You'll have 2 hours to write." So they came that day, and he passed out the exam handbooks, booklets, and he said, "Okay, 2 hours. I'll give you a warning, 15, 10, and 5, and then you turn in your exams. None will be accepted late." So they wrote furiously and copiously. 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5, turned them in. They came up, and they made a large stack on the professor's desk. But one guy sitting right back there just kept writing, wasn't paying any attention. First, the professor was tempted to call him out, and then he got a little upset, and then he got angry. How dare this guy? And then he got curious. What's he going to do? So the professor sat down to wait just to see what would come of this. Wrote for 5 more, 10 more, 15 more minutes. Finally, he got up, stretched, put on his backpack, looked at his test, and then came up and was about to drop it on the pile when the professor said, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm turning in my exam." "No, you're not. I was very clear with the instructions. You cannot, I will not accept." And he was very clear with the student. The student looked first surprised, then shocked, then offended. He said, "Do you know who I am?" He said, "No, I don't, and I don't care to know." He said, "Well, good." Picked up about half the exam, put his in the middle, dropped the others on top, and then turned and sauntered out of the classroom. Why? Because sometimes it's good to be just a number, to be anonymous. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's painful to be anonymous, to not be known, to wonder if you matter, to question if your life counts, to query if there will be any lasting effect from what you have done. Sometimes it's painful. In fact, this is the first Sabbath of the new school year. I realize there are always programs in motion at Loma University, but officially speaking, this is the first Sabbath of the official school year. That means we have many students among us, new students, returning students, which creates the potential to look around at all these other faces. This last Wednesday, this entire facility was crammed with students. Do I matter? Do I count? I'm just one student in one class. That is one program in one school. And then there are more schools, and then there are students in those, and then there are tens of thousands of graduates over all the years. Who am I? I'm just anonymous. And it's not just students who may be asking the question. There may be those among us who are in driving the car of their life keenly aware that there's much more life in the rearview mirror than there is in the windshield. And that brings them to asking those questions. Have I done something that counted? Will my life matter? Is there something that stays behind? Or am I doomed to be cast onto the ash heap of history with an epitaph that says nothing more than known by few, loved by less, and forgotten by all? Am I someone who counts? So if you've ever wrestled with those realities, wondered about those things, this series is specifically for you. Because we look at some persons in Scripture who had every reason to ask themselves those questions. And yet 2,000 years, 3,000 years later, though they don't have names, though they're anonymous, they still speak. So we begin today with a woman. A woman in a difficult situation. In fact, in order to try to grasp her story told in 2 Samuel 14, we have to set a bit of the context and give a bit of the background. It happens during the reign of David, King David, the king that is at the pinnacle of Israel's history, the king who is the king by which all subsequent kings will be judged. David, that shepherd boy back here who had a meteoric rise to fame and stardom and power, and whose life seemed nothing but an uninterrupted series of victories until that moment when his looking turned to leering, and Bathsheba's husband was murdered, and she was with child. That is a pivotal moment in David's story. After that, as you trace the outlines of his story, you realize that if the early part of his life was defined by upward rise, the second part of his life in many ways is defined by steep decline. Not always just in his life, but in his family's life. In fact, if you chose one word by which to describe the story of David's family, and more specifically of the way David parented, it would probably be the word permissive. Permissive. Very little evidence of him saying, no, you can't do that. Here are the boundaries. Stop. Little evidence of that. Bible students, Bible scholars have wondered why. Some have said, with sound reason, it seems to me, that it's likely because of his lack of feeling that he had the moral high ground on which to stand in order to guide his kids. Whether that's true or not, the reality remains that his family was a sordid and bloody mess. That's where we start to narrow in on today's story, because its most immediate background is with his son Amnon. Amnon, following in the footsteps of his father, got to looking and leering too long at his half-sister Tamar and desired her and talked to her about it. She simply said, no, you can't do this, but ask the king. I can be given to you as a wife. Amnon would have none of it. Soiled her reputation, damaged her soul, wasted her body. Her brother, full brother, Absalom, hears of it. And he burns, understandably, justifiably, with rage. Understand, they live in a world of blood vengeance, lex talionis, the law of retribution. It was based on what was said by Moses back in Exodus and Leviticus. Remember what he said? Eye for eye, bruise for bruise, tooth for tooth, life for life. Well, in that context, it had been intended to say, let the punishment equal the crime. Don't over-punish, in other words. That was its intent. Don't suffer a bruise and pay for it with a life, in other words. But that law had been twisted, at least in practice, and it had become a matter of retaliation and blood vengeance. And Absalom burns with a desire for blood vengeance over what has been done to his sister. And so he now schemes and plots and plans. And Amnon pays for it with his life. And thus the house of David is soiled with more blood as Absalom flees for safety to another place. He's banished. And it's right there that we enter today's story. Because David's general, the man in charge of his armed forces, is Joab. Joab wants to see if reconciliation might be possible. But Joab, for whatever reason, doesn't have the chutzpah to talk to David directly. So now he's scheming and planning. And here we find the woman from Tekoa, a town about which we know very little. Amos was born there. It's mentioned a few times. A woman about whom we know even less. They enter the picture through Joab. Listen to what he writes, starting 2 Samuel, or what the narrator writes, 2 Samuel 14, beginning with verse 1. Joab realized how much the king longed to see Absalom, so he sent for a woman from Tekoa who had a reputation for great wisdom. He said to her, "Pretend you are in mourning, wear mourning clothes and don't put on lotions. Act like a woman who has been in mourning for the dead for a long time. Then go to the king and tell him the story I'm about to tell you." Then Joab told her what to say. When the woman from Tekoa approached the king, she bowed with her face to the ground in deep respect and cried out, "O king, help me." "What's the trouble?" the king asked. "Alas, I'm a widow," she replied. "My husband is dead. My 2 sons had a fight out in the field, and since no one was there to stop it, one of them was killed. Now the rest of the family is demanding, 'Let us have your son. We will execute him for murdering his brother. He doesn't deserve to inherit the family property.' They want to extinguish the only coal I have left, and my husband's name and family will disappear from the face of the earth." "Leave it to me," the king told her. "Go home, and I'll see to it that no one touches him." "Oh, thank you, my lord the king," the woman from Tekoa replied. "If you are criticized for helping me, let the blame fall on me and on my father's house, and let the king and his throne be innocent." "If anyone objects," the king said, "bring him to me. I can assure you he will never harm you again." Then she said, "Please swear to me by the Lord your God that you won't let anyone take vengeance against my son. I want no more bloodshed." That's a remarkable statement for a woman in a palace to make of a warrior king. "I want no more bloodshed." "As surely as the Lord lives," he replied, "not a hair on your son's head will be disturbed." "Please allow me to ask one more thing of my lord the king," she said. "Go ahead and speak," he responded. She replied, "Why don't you do as much for the people of God as you have promised to do for me? You have convicted yourself in making this decision because you have refused to bring home your own banished son. All of us must die eventually. Our lives are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. But God does not just sweep life away. Instead, He devises ways to bring us back when we have been separated from Him." Notice 2 things. Notice, number 1, she is called a woman of great wisdom. You can see why. In the way she chooses to weave the tale, to spin the story as she leads the king down the primrose path to self-conviction. Wise. What the text does not say, but what we clearly see before us, is that she was also a woman of courage. Here she is caught in the middle of scheming, conniving, angry, bloodthirsty warriors. It's the kind of situation in which a wink and a nod can end someone's life. The king pounding on the table can have someone dragged out and executed. And here stands this woman in a man's world and has the temerity to say, I want no more bloodshed. Courage. In fact, listen to the words of Old Testament scholar Bruce Birch, who writes, David has been led by the woman's skillfully played role to compromise the law of blood vengeance. As Brueggemann has aptly stated, when the killer is acknowledged to be a beloved son, vengeance can be overcome. The woman can now drop her ruse and reveal the true nature of the concern for which Joab sent her. It is a moment of risk and courage. One does not meddle lightly in the king's family matters. Her tone becomes deferential as she asks and receives permission to speak a word to the king. The intent of her speech is clear. If David can restore the son to the woman in her hypothetical case, then he can find a way to restore Absalom to his own family and kingdom. Absalom has got his own issues, which will follow. But this woman is seeking peaceful reconciliation. Wise, courageous. But that's not what really grips me about the woman, the nameless, faceless, anonymous woman from Tekoa. What grabs me is her understanding of the character of God. An understanding that emerges out of a world in which God is viewed to be the warrior God, the God of vengeance, the God of warfare. In that world, well, notice what she says. This time I'll read it out of the NIV. I've been reading out of the NLT. Listen to how the NIV renders it. Like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so we must but die. Stop there for just a moment, because right there, what she is referring to is Amnon. What she is essentially saying is king. Amnon's life is gone. It's like water spilled on the ground. It cannot be recovered. You can't pick up spilled milk. It's over. It's done. It's gone. Now the choice is yours, what you do next. Then she continues, but that is not what God desires. Rather, He devises ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from Him. Where did she get that understanding of God? God devises ways so that the banished person will not remain banished from Him. Contemporary English version renders it this way. God doesn't take our lives. Instead, He figures out ways of bringing us back when we run away. That's what she's saying. She's saying, "O King, you're the sweet singer of Israel. You have composed countless psalms. You have sung praise to the God of heaven. You have praised His glory and His goodness and His love. You have praised all of that. King, live your own music. Live what you preach." Because in His high and holy heaven, God on His throne is occupied with devising ways to bring the banished person home. Wow. This woman, unknown to us, continues to speak to us 3,000 years later. Mother, He speaks to you. You whose heart is broken by your son's decisions. The son you brought to Sabbath School, church school. Son who was involved in outreach. Who now in his early 20s is out of control. Drugs have taken over his life. His life is spinning downward into a deeper and darker hole. More anger, more rage. Want nothing to do with God. True story. A father walked into his son's room, the kind of son I've just described, 2, 3 a.m., to find his son passed out on the bed, hair matted, the stench of alcohol and vomit in the air, needles nearby. He walked in to find his wife, the boy's mother, quietly weeping, stroking her son's hair. Father said, "What are you doing?" She said, "It's the only time he lets me love him." Mother, this woman speaks to you. She says to you, right now, on his throne, God has your son's life before him. He's looking at the situations, the circumstances, the choices, the decisions, the possibilities, the people, and he is devising ways to bring that son home. And you might be part of it. Spouse, she speaks to you 3,000 years later. That wife of your dreams, that wife of your early love, that wife with whom you had worship and prayed and worshiped, served in ministries. Took two things: horrible, unjust, and unfair treatment by a church institution, and the untimely, inexplicable death of a dear friend, for her to say, "I'm done. Don't talk to me about it anymore." Husband, you know you can't. Merely raising it, and the rage will be vomited all over you. She speaks to you, husband. She says, God is devising ways. You might or might not be a part of it. But he's looking for every opportunity to bring her home. Roommate, your friend, lost. You pray? Well, maybe you sing. Maybe you sing the words of the old song, "Can you reach my friend?" You're the only one who can. Lord, I know you love him. Help him understand. And the woman speaks and says, God is devising ways to bring him home. That's what grips me about this woman. Do you know why it grips me so deeply? Is because there is so much we know that she did not. And yet she still had that understanding of God. She never had the opportunity to read the magnificent hymn of Paul in Philippians 2 that essentially says, God stepped down the starry stair steps of the sky and wrapped himself in human flesh in order to bring the banished one home. She would never understand the story of a little hamlet named Bethlehem and a baby that was born there. She would never know that that baby would grow up to walk the dusty trails of Galilee and to tell stories like a waiting father and a wayward son, to tell stories about a shepherd that would risk the 99 to bring the banished one home. She would never hear the name Zacchaeus, that little man of big reputation who nobody wanted anything to do with, to whom this teacher would say, the Son of Man came to seek and to save you, to bring you home. She never knew that. She would never know of a winding street through an ancient town that came to be known as the Via Dolorosa. She would never understand that an itinerant, bruised, beaten, bloodied rabbi stooped under the burden of a rough-hewn cross would stagger down that lane to bring the banished home. She would never have the privilege of hearing him utter those excruciating words, not excruciating because of his soul, but because of the wounds in his body, meant from the core of his soul, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. She would never have the opportunity to consider the cruciform form of one nailed to a cross, hanging suspended between heaven and earth, because earth did not want him and heaven could not yet claim him, and yet still cry out that one word cry of victory, tetelestai, it is finished. Father, I have brought the banished home. She would never understand that, know that, see that. And yet, her understanding of God is mature beyond that of many of us who do know that. That God is constantly devising ways to bring the banished home. So what do you say to that, Your Majesty? King? A response? Verse 18. I must know one thing, the king replied, and tell me the truth. Yes, my lord the king, she responded. Did Joab put you up to this? And the woman replied, my lord the king, how can I deny it? Nobody can hide anything from you. Yes, Joab sent me and told me what to say. He did it to place the matter before you in a different light, but you're as wise as an angel of God, and you understand everything that happens among us. So the king sent for Joab and told him, all right, go and bring back the young man, Absalom. SDA Bible commentary, David himself had grievously sinned and had stood in need of mercy. It was only because of the great mercy of heaven that he still remained alive and retained his throne. These words of the wise woman of Tekoa deeply touched the heart of David and moved him to mercy. God persistently, consistently, insistently devises ways to bring the banished person home. So let me tell you a story. It's actually a story I've told from this platform before, a fair number of years ago now. It was a funeral of a friend who had gotten into such a dark place that he couldn't get out of it and took his own life. And we gathered here trying to make sense of it. And in particular, trying to understand God. God, how do you view this? How are we to think of this in light of who you are? And it was then that I remembered a story. A story I had heard from the preacher and sociologist, Baptist, Tony Campolo, spoken here on many occasions. I believe that's from whom I heard it. It's the story, so goes the tale, of Peter and John, or in some traditions, St. Peter and St. John, being given the task, along with the list at the gates of glory, of determining who gets in and who stays out. You let in whoever's on this list, everyone else keep them out. And they, according to the tale, took their job very seriously. They had a list, they were checking it twice, wanted to find out who was naughty or nice. You're in, you're here, you're in, you're out, nope, no name here, come in, stay out. They took it seriously. But then they went in that night to the supper table the great banquet hall, the supper table. And then they begin to know, how did you get in? How did you get in? We turned you away. Nobody was spilling the beans. They kept asking, how did they? Next day, they got more serious, more careful, checking IDs, checking names, turning away, welcoming in. That night, more people they had turned away. Their focus became, find out how these people are getting in here. And then one day, a young man ran up to him and said, I know how it's happening. I know exactly how they're getting in. How are they getting in? The young man said, I saw it myself. It's Jesus. He's pulling them over the back fence. That's how they're getting in. I think it was Campolo from whom I heard that story. But as I read about this woman of Tekoa, I got to wondering, was that story original with Campolo? Or is that a very old story? Because the truth is simple. The woman of Tekoa was very good at weaving tales, spinning stories that reflected powerfully and poignantly and positively on the face of God. Gracious God, let us be part of your devisings, wherever you see fit, to bring banished people home. In Jesus' name, amen.